I was born into a family that could be called respectable, though now, looking back, I have a completely different understanding of what that word truly means. Back then, in our house with its austere and impeccably styled interior, I took such concepts for granted. My parents were people who lived by clear, strict rules, as if following a meticulously crafted schedule. Rules about what it meant to be proper and respectable, as if their lives were confined within the rigid frames of a perfectly staged theatrical production. They acted as though every word, every gesture, and every choice was predetermined by a script that we all had to follow. They believed the world was divided into those who obeyed the rules and those who didn't. To them, respectable people were those who adhered flawlessly to established traditions, like actors rehearsing for a play. My sister Emma was their perfect child. It was as if she had been born for the role. From early childhood, she knew how to please our parents. She always said the right things, wore the right clothes, dated the right boys, the ones from equally right families with whom, naturally, our family maintained connections. Emma was their embodiment of perfection and didn't even try to hide it. Every action of hers seemed scripted. She was exactly what they envisioned when they planned what their daughter would be like. She helped our mother organize church events, accompanied our father to Sunday services, supported every one of their opinions, and participated actively in community life, serving as a role model for all the other children in our respectable society. With each passing year, she became more and more like the idealized figure they had always wanted, someone with not a shadow of doubt about her place as the daughter they had hoped for and the one everyone was supposed to admire. I, however, always felt like an outsider in this world of ideals. In that meticulously curated space where every gesture was dictated by obligatory norms, I saw how my parents constructed their image for the outside world, and it became increasingly clear to me that their idea of a proper life and a normal family held no significance for me. The norms they tried to impose on me were like a costume I could never manage to put on. My role in their theater was far less defined. I didn't want to play along, couldn't follow the template, and couldn't be like Emma. I was more like some imperceptible element of the set design, unnoticed and irrelevant to the production. You know how there's always someone who is simply present but whose absence wouldn't disrupt the performance? That was me. My parents didn't know how to direct me in their production. I didn't inspire the admiration my sister did, but I wasn't completely neglected either. To them, I was an empty space they didn't know how to fill. Emma thrived in their world. She was their pride, the symbol of a family that followed the rules and upheld societal norms. She was always in the spotlight, reinforcing their status. We were like two opposites, yet we shared the same goal: to meet their expectations. Emma was the elegant, impeccably performing actress on stage, while I stood in the wings, unable to play the role that had been assigned to me. My life was utterly different, not as bright, not as perfect, and not as alluringly respectable. In that house filled with exquisite napkins, polished dining tables, gleaming silver spoons, and porcelain cups, I felt out of place. My mother and father, in their perfectly knotted ties and carefully chosen church outfits, seemed like people who saw the world through a single window, while I tried to escape through another, even though I understood my efforts were futile. When they asked me what I wanted, I couldn't answer. Their world was so different from what I envisioned for myself that any decision, even the simplest one, felt rigid and unacceptable. I couldn't become what they wanted me to be. And they, in turn, couldn't understand me. That moment when I realized my lack of fit was almost tragic. Yet, I couldn't stop trying to find my own path, one that would free me from the rigid framework of their ideals of propriety. Aunt Claire always brought gifts when she visited. They were never random but always carefully chosen, showing she truly paid attention to what people liked. My parents received them with practiced smiles and proper words of gratitude, as if this too were part of yet another scene in our domestic play. We all played our roles, and perhaps at that moment, I was part of it too. But as soon as her car disappeared down the driveway, leaving our house, the true opinions, hidden beneath a mask of courtesy, began to pour out. Mother would sigh, twisting her fingers into an invisible chain as she said, "Can you believe she's still seeing someone at her age?" She would use air quotes with her hands, emphasizing all the doubt embedded in her words. "Living in sin, that's what it is," she'd declare, as if Aunt Claire had chosen a path of disgrace, abandoning the sacred principles of our family. And, of course, she would start recounting Claire's life story. "No husband, no children. What kind of life is that for a woman?" she'd repeat, her words sounding like a verdict. Father was no less critical. He would hold the gift Claire had brought, and at first glance, it was genuinely beautiful, elegant and refined. But his voice carried the familiar tone of disappointment, as if he were scrutinizing not the gift but her lifestyle and choices. "With all that theater money, she could afford something better," he'd say. I always had the sense he was searching for some hidden flaw in the gift, some wrongness, as if it symbolized her misguided life. He would continue, "But no, she spends it all on herself." And in that final word, there was so much disdain that I could almost imagine him raising an eyebrow if he weren't so composed in his mannerisms. They always talked about how much money she must be making. "She spends almost all her money on herself," my mother would say, her eyes filling with pity she perhaps wanted to conceal but couldn't. In her view, Aunt Claire was a woman who didn't know the true meaning of sacrifice, motherhood, or family values. Her life was something entirely different from what was considered normal. My father, on the other hand, often expressed his belief that people like Aunt Claire were merely examples of how not to live. He was convinced she had no real understanding of what it meant to be a woman and didn't consider her life a model worth emulating. I watched all this from the sidelines, sitting at the table and listening attentively to their discussions. Everything they said was familiar and predictable, like a scene I had witnessed countless times before. I never interfered in these conversations. Like them, played my role in this house, in this theater that was our life. But in those moments when they spoke about Aunt Claire, something inside me stirred, as if I instinctively sensed that this carefully constructed world wasn't entirely real. Something important, something connected to my own identity, was missing from this performance, but I couldn't yet figure out what it was. My mother and father firmly believed that following their rules was the only path to a happy life, and perhaps I once thought so too. But the older I grew, the clearer it became that there was more to life than simply being proper. The more I observed my sister Emma, the more I realized that her life was as much of a performance as our parents' lives. She was their favorite actress, while I was merely an observer. And so, in those moments when Aunt Claire left, and the talk about her wrong choices subsided, I began to feel, almost across an invisible boundary, that I wanted something different. I couldn't quite articulate what, but I knew that my life in this cage, in this theater where every movement was preordained, could not be my choice. I didn't know exactly what I wanted, but it was clear I wouldn't follow the rules someone else had written for me. My mother and father always said life was a game, and it had to be played correctly. But increasingly, I felt that this game had long since lost its meaning. Years passed. My sister Emma married Jason, the son of our parents' closest friends, right after graduating high school. It was exactly the kind of respectable marriage my parents adored. They had started orchestrating it from the very first meeting, as if it were not just the union of two people but a crowning achievement of their upbringing and life standards. Emma looked happy, and my parents seemed unable to hide their pride. Everything was going smoothly, traditions were upheld, and now the family had gained another, proper person. Everything unfolded just as they had wanted, just as they had planned. I followed the same path. I couldn't help but notice how important it was to them that I also chose the right person. And, of course, it happened before I even finished my final year of school. The moment I expressed a desire to go to college, my mother couldn't help but lay down her obligatory requirement: "We found the perfect man for you." It was so, them. As if I couldn't and shouldn't make the choice myself. As always, My mother knew what was best for me. "Richard Thompson, you remember the Thompsons, don't you?" she asked one evening as we sat at dinner. "Such a respectable family. His parents are true pillars of society. And, of course, so is he." I nodded faintly, trying to conjure up his face. They were all the same, proper, attractive, impeccably mannered, with endless tales of their family's achievements, which fit perfectly into the picture my parents had painted. "But I want to go to college," I said, as if desperately trying to cling to some semblance of personal choice, to escape this cursed circle of expectations. I understood my refusal wouldn't come without consequences, but I couldn't help but hope. They didn't react to my words as I had anticipated. "Richard is planning to take over his father's business," my mother continued, as if she hadn't heard me. "He needs a supportive wife, not some career woman." These words swept over me like a cold wind. Career woman. This was the term my parents used to label all women who chose to rely not on a man's support but on their own strength, their own goals. My parents firmly believed that a woman's happiness lay in male support. At first, I tried to argue, to reason with them, explaining that I wanted to study, to become someone more than just a wife. But their assured look silently overpowered me. They had already decided I needed to be with him. As always, they had already arranged a meeting. Richard turned out to be exactly what I had expected, entirely proper. He was handsome, but there was nothing in his eyes that stirred anything within me. He wasn't a bad person, he was just dull. He talked about his father's business, the importance of continuing the family legacy, his plans for the future, all of it as predictable as morning coffee. He didn't know how to talk about anything other than his work and his family, and at some point, I realized he simply didn't see me. He looked right through me as if I were just another piece of this life where everything had to be in its proper place. While my parents looked at us with pride, as if we were the perfect couple, I felt my own dreams fading away. I tried to imagine myself beside him, in his world of business meetings and formal dinners, and I couldn't. Richard was the exact replica of everything my parents considered ideal, and at the same time, he was a distant, alien figure to me. His blonde hair, always neatly trimmed and carefully combed, his way of speaking, calm, confident, with an undertone of certainty in his place in life, all of it felt hollow, devoid of inner fire. I could see the look in my parents' eyes when they watched Richard and me. It was full of approval and the hopes they had placed on me. In their eyes, I should have been grateful for this match, for the gift of fate they had presented to me, and I was ready to do whatever it took to show them how much I appreciated their efforts. I tried to imagine how they would react if I told them I didn't want to be with Richard, that his world was not my world, that my own dreams were carrying me far away. But, as always, their opinion mattered more to me. I couldn't shatter their idea of what was right and what should be accepted. I sat with Richard in that silent room, listening to his stories, and I realized that my life was slipping away from me, like sand through my fingers. "I'm leaving for college in August." This statement fell like a heavy stone into the silence, which instantly became deafening. My mother's face turned pale, as if all the blood had drained from her body, while my father opened and closed his mouth like a fish, trying to find words that could express the storm within him. He seemed at a loss about what to do with this news, how to handle it, how to live with it. "Get out," he finally burst out, his voice filled with anger, as if his entire world had crumbled in an instant. "If you want to throw away everything we've planned, if this house means nothing to you, then get out." He hurled the words like a poisonous arrow, and it felt as though it struck me straight in the heart. "You're no daughter of mine," his words echoed in my mind. I stood there, unable to respond, but their sharp attacks pierced my soul, and I felt myself shrinking inward, as if trying to disappear. I went upstairs to my room and grabbed the bag I had packed just in case this moment came. In case something like this happened. And I had always known this moment was inevitable. I walked out the front door, closing it behind me. Behind me, through the noise and shouting, I could hear my mother crying, her tears streaming like rivers. My father was loudly slamming things around, venting his furious anger on anything within reach. My hands were trembling as I dialed the number. I hadn't spoken to her in years, though I had kept her number on my phone all this time, like a lifeline I might cling to in a moment of need. I hesitated, nervously staring at the screen, expecting that she might not answer, that she might have forgotten about me, just as I had forgotten her. But she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice sounded warm and familiar, like a comforting embrace that wrapped around me from within. In that instant, everything happening at that moment made sense, as if all I had gone through had been leading up to this conversation. "Claire, it's Jessica," I said. There was a pause between us, and I felt her voice soften. "Jessie, sweetheart, what happened?" Her words were like a gentle rain washing everything away, carrying the pain with it. I told her everything. About how Richard was unfaithful, about how my parents reacted to my choice, to my desire to live my own life instead of following their plans. I told her how my father had pushed me out of the house, how my mother had stayed behind, lost in his shouting, and how I had left, trying to remain invisible in the storm, so as not to be consumed by the anger and despair. Claire listened, and her silence was filled with understanding. Everything I told her was familiar to her, her life, her struggle with the same constraints I had faced. Just like me, she knew what it was like to be trapped in a cage of respectability, stripped of the freedom to choose and to be herself. I threw myself into my business management classes, determined to make her proud of me. These words became my mantra, a conviction I repeated to myself over and over, regardless of the circumstances. I put all my energy into my studies, leaving behind all the disappointments that had plagued my relationships with my parents and sister. And honestly, it was easier than facing everyone who seemed not to understand me or my aspirations. I knew I had to succeed, if only to feel worthy of their attention, to earn the respect I so desperately sought. We talked almost every day, and these conversations became my only connection to the world I had left behind. Aunt Claire was my anchor, even from a distance, the only person who truly cared about what was happening in my life. She wanted to know everything, about my classes, my roommates, my life in general. Even about my parents and Emma, though I rarely mentioned them. But she listened, even when I was silent, paying close attention as if peering at me through the thin veil of an invisible bond. During one of our weekly calls, she mentioned hearing a rumor that my sister had had another baby. I felt something tighten inside me. A third child. Jason Jr., she hadn't even considered giving him a different name. Just a clone of what had come before. It was so typical of Emma, to play by all the rules, never breaking from tradition, never stepping outside the boundaries of comfortable standards. Did she ever look around? Did she ever strive for anything beyond becoming the perfect mother, wife, and daughter? I didn't know, and honestly, I couldn't imagine it. I simply shook my head, feeling a heavy mix of disappointment and resentment. Why revisit this conversation? I didn't want to be part of her life, if only because she had never strayed from the role she played. I quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward upcoming midterms, new projects, and school. It was easier than talking about family. Easier than trying to understand how someone could be happy blending into a template instead of living their own life. Emma chose her path, and I chose mine. We were too different even to attempt to compare our lives. Yet, sometimes, the thought wouldn't leave me. Is she truly happy playing the role of the perfect daughter, wife, and mother? Or will there come a time, when her children grow up, that she'll want something more for herself? Someday, will she feel that her life has become just a reflection of others' expectations, that she's trapped in a cage of her own dogmas and standards? For several days, I wrestled with these questions, trying to understand how I really felt about my place in the world. Doubts often crept in, especially when memories of the past and my family overwhelmed everything else. But just when I thought the answers were far away, I would think about the company, its structure, and how I had become an integral part of it. Taking on a leadership role at Aunt's CLA City felt almost natural. Over the years, my aunt and I had grown so close that I couldn't imagine my life anywhere else. Here, I felt like I belonged, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't all so simple. The company was exceptional, full of potential, with a clear structure and people who valued my contributions. Yet sometimes, it felt as if the whole system was part of the very framework I had once rebelled against. Perhaps I was following the path laid out for me, but something inside still demanded more. Aunt CLA had always been an example to me. She never confined herself to a box. She did what she needed to do, unconcerned with others' opinions, free from the need to follow the crowd. Her independence, her strength of spirit, always drew me in, like a light at the end of a tunnel. My life was just beginning, and I was becoming increasingly certain that I alone would decide who I would be and where I would go. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before her death. She never sent it. Her last attempt at reconciliation remained unfulfilled, frozen in that empty, unopened envelope. I carefully folded the letters, feeling the cold weight of their contents seep into my hands, and placed them back in the drawer, closing away the unspoken pain they contained. My father hadn't even come to say goodbye to his sister. He chose pride over family, chose everything that seemed more important than simple human connection. His decisions were always like that, so precise, so rigid. Life, as he often said, doesn't wait. It moves forward, whether you're ready for it or not. 2 years had passed since Aunt Clara's death. It was a long, endlessly drawn-out process of adjusting to the loss, coming to terms with the fact that the woman who had once been like a second mother to me was gone. During that time, I continued living in her house, now my house. Everything had become familiar, the shadows in the corners she left behind, her old photographs on the walls, her books on the shelves. But I learned to see it all without really noticing, growing used to it. I threw myself into work. It was easier than dwelling on what had been left behind. Being promoted to senior manager was a kind of solace, as if work, like a formal suit, concealed everything, hid it all away. A new corner office, a spacious room with views of the city, a salary that would have astonished me just a few years ago, all of it made me feel a little more secure. Everything was right, everything was according to plan. But one day, as I sat at my desk, once again immersed in reports and figures, my phone rang. My mother's number appeared on the screen. When I saw it, something inside me trembled. So many years had passed, and I hadn't heard her voice even once. I remembered how she always called when there was something to discuss, something to decide, always convinced of her own rightness. At first, my hand froze. I almost instinctively reached out to press decline, as I had done dozens of times before. But suddenly, like a lightning strike, the realization hit: I had to answer. Something in that moment told me it was important. I took a deep breath and made my decision. I pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. My mother's voice, when she spoke, was quieter than I remembered. Entirely different. It lacked the energy, the insistence with which she used to tell me what to do. She began cautiously, as if testing the waters, afraid that my silence might make her even more vulnerable. "We need to see you. Can you come?" she asked. The words she spoke were nothing like what I had expected. They sounded like a quiet plea, without the usual confidence, as though she wanted something more but didn't know how to ask for it. My heart raced. It felt like the moment when I could no longer hide from this part of my life, from these people, from this family. I felt everything inside me clench, as old fears and old wounds resurfaced. But I said nothing. I remained silent. Pure silence on the other end of the line. I could picture the old house falling apart more and more, slowly but inevitably. The walls that had once held so many memories now seemed like a shadow of what they used to be. Each day, its appearance grew more weathered, its structure losing shape, like a body drained of life. But I wasn't upset about it. I smiled to myself, knowing that across town, a new house was being built, my house. It was fresh, modern, with clean lines and the latest technology that promised comfort and stability. With each passing month, as the new house took shape, I felt something else begin to take shape in my life. It was a pattern I should have recognized much earlier. At first, I thought it all started with genuine gratitude, with the moment my parents first acknowledged my achievements. But gradually, gratitude turned into expectation. Expectation that I would always do the right thing, always deliver, always fulfill what they wanted. And eventually, it became entitlement to my efforts and my sacrifices, which they deemed obligatory. The first shift was barely noticeable, like a gentle nudge, unnoticed by anyone but me. I no longer heard words of gratitude for what I brought, for what I did. Instead, I began to hear other phrases. Things like, "Oh, we were hoping for a different brand," or "we really needed something else." These words quietly crept into my life, replacing the ones that had come before. At first, I tried to ignore them, but over time, they became part of the usual conversation. And then came the direct requests. My mother, as always, would call, but now she didn't even bother with polite phrasing. She would simply say, "We need a new washing machine. The one at Sears is on sale. Can you pick it up this weekend?" It was no longer a request but an obligation. I had to do all these things because that's just how it was supposed to be. Dad joined the stream of demands too, as if he could no longer stand idly by. "Your sister's kids need new school clothes. Good ones, not cheap stuff from a discount store. Remember, they need to look respectable." With every new call, I felt myself being pulled deeper into this endless cycle of obligations that I had never chosen. This wasn't something I did out of a desire to help, it had become something they simply expected of me. And I realized there was no way out. This had become my role, my duty. Each time I picked up another washing machine or bought new clothes for Emma's children, I felt my life shrink, my dreams and ambitions slipping away, leaving me with nothing but what was expected. I had always done the right thing, always followed the path laid out for me. But at some point, I realized I was no longer living my life. I had become nothing more than a tool for maintaining their world, their ideal. But deep down, I still felt that somewhere, beyond this cursed cycle, there was another world. A world where I could be myself, where my desires didn't turn into obligations, and my dreams weren't just another task to check off a list. Yet that world felt so distant. "Mom, I can't. Mom." The words stuck in my throat, unable to break free. I tried to say something, but her look, full of contempt and disappointment, seemed to paralyze me. She stood before me like a stone wall, and I felt her anger burning everything inside me. "How dare you come here, refusing to help your parents after we sacrificed everything for you?" Her voice was as cold as ice, her words piercing me like needles. Dad joined us, his face flushed, his eyes filled with fury. He seemed ready to explode at me, but I still couldn't understand what was happening, why this was happening now. "We asked for just one thing, one simple thing, to make your mother happy on our anniversary," she continued, her hands trembling with rage. "But you're too selfish. You're too busy counting your money to care about your family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The room seemed to spin, and I struggled to catch my breath. I felt as though I was standing on the edge, ready to fall into the abyss of their words, the abyss of their accusations. "So this is how they see me? So this is how you raised your daughter?" Mom shouted, her voice filled with disappointment and pain. Her words struck me, leaving invisible wounds on my soul. One of their friends, sitting in the corner, jumped up, clearly enjoying the drama. She asked, barely hiding her smirk, "How is she not her mother's daughter? Isn't she supposed to buy you the car you need? Instead, she comes here empty-handed and ruins our celebration." Empty-handed. Those words thundered in my head like a storm. I couldn't stay silent any longer. My hands trembled, but I pulled out the envelope I had in my bag. It felt just as cold and rigid as the accusations being hurled at me. Inside was a check, not just any check, but a sum I had saved over time, money I had earned trying to meet the expectations drilled into me. I held it in my hands, finally finding my voice. I stood up abruptly, my legs barely holding me, but I gripped the check as if it could save me. Mom saw it and sneered, but I spoke anyway. You want to know why I didn't do it? Why I didn't buy you that car? I said, unable to hold back any longer. We don't want to hear your excuses. Mom interrupted sharply. Her words hammered in my head, breaking down everything I had built. I stood there, teeth clenched, trying to hold myself together. We all stood, surrounded by the echoes of old grievances and unspoken words, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same. 5 years have passed since the day I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, leaving my family and their discontent behind. I left with a mix of bitterness and relief. Breaking away from them was the final step toward freedom, toward building a life where I could be myself, not just a tool to fulfill their desires. The house I was building for my family became my sanctuary. I finished it not for them, but for myself. The spacious rooms were filled not with others' expectations, but with things that made me happy: books, paintings, warm-colored walls, and windows flooded with light. That house became a symbol of my new life, a life where, for the first time, I truly felt at home. I continued working in the company I had built with Aunt Clara. She left me not only a legacy of land and savings, but also lessons in courage and authenticity. Her voice echoed in my mind whenever I made important decisions. The business thrived, and for the first time, I felt like I was living the life I had always wanted. Sometimes I heard about my parents and sister. Rumors reached me through old acquaintances or stray conversations. My parents, having lost their home and reputation, had moved to a small house in the countryside. Emma, left alone with her children, was struggling to make ends meet. Requests for help came to me, through mutual contacts or indirectly via messages I never read. I could no longer be their savior. But one quiet Sunday evening, the phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw Emma's name. After a long pause, I decided to answer. Jessie. Her voice was weak, barely audible. She began to talk, telling me how her life hadn't turned out the way she expected. About how her children had grown up but suffered because of her mistakes. About how she had finally realized she hadn't been living her own life but merely following others' roles. Her voice trembled, and I heard a sincerity I had never heard before. You were right, she whispered. All this time, I thought I was playing the right role. But in the end, I just lost myself. Her words brought Aunt Clara to mind. Her love for freedom, her disdain for hypocrisy, and her courage to be herself. At that moment, I felt the circle close. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't fix their mistakes. But I could offer the chance for a new story, for myself and perhaps for Emma. Not out of obligation, but because I was finally free to choose who to let into my life. We agreed to meet. It wasn't an attempt to return to old relationships, but a step toward a new beginning. A step without expectations or control, just honesty. I hung up the phone and looked at the picture of Aunt Clara on the shelf. You would approve, I said to her in the silence of the room. At that moment, I knew my life finally belonged to me.